Let's talk disk drives. So it's been a while since I posted my first video about moving from creating music on the PC to creating music on a Mac. And the reason is I wanted to have each part of the story as a complete video rather than starting with one video and then saying, well, you'll have to wait for part 2 later. So let's start the process. The first thing I realised was that I was going to have to do something about my disk drives. I run my system off a number of external disk drives, which hold things like my contact library, various other bits and pieces. And also, as I've previously described, my laptop had twin SSDs. One that was the system drive that ran the software, and the other that was effectively my projects file where all the audio got streamed to. Separating the two disk drives made life easier. When I started looking into moving across, I quickly realised that I had a problem with the file formats. Windows runs on NTFS, the network file system. Apple runs on APFS, the Apple file system, which are mutually incompatible. So simply unplugging my disk drives from the laptop and plugging them into the Mac wasn't going to work. It wouldn't be able to read the files, at least not without an interpreter software, which would then slow things down. You can get an NTFS driver for the Mac, but it seemed to be building in a problem that I could avoid. The solution lay in the extended file allocation table, or to shorten it, ExFAT. ExFAT is a format that both the Mac and the PC can read. The problem was to reformat my disk drives so they were ExFAT would wipe them. And that's where a little bit of foresight came in handy. Over the years, I've been the IT help desk to my household, and we've been running up to 5 laptops all at once. And every time a laptop came up for renewal, every 3 or 4 years when it had reached the end of its useful life and all homework had been done on it, or enough internet browsing had been done, they used to come to me for a new laptop. And a new laptop would be purchased, set up, logged onto the network, and then there was the issue about transferring all those files from the old laptop. What I used to do was take the disk drives out. I would always take the disk drive out before I disposed of a laptop. You never know what's on it and what could be retrieved. And I would buy one of these. This is an external disk drive housing. This particular one came from the old Dabs online store. Again, a company in Bolton, not that far from me. And the laptop drive would go in here. This would then be plugged into the new laptop and the contents of the user folder transferred across. So when the recipient got hold of their new laptop, it had all their files already in situ. Not a problem. I would then reformat this just to NTFS, and from that I would then have a small number of external disk drives available for people if they wanted some storage. What I did with this was I reformatted it to ExFAT, and then one by one I copied the contents of my external disk drives onto it, reformatted the external disk drive to ExFAT, and copied them back. Now, given that my contact drive, for example, is almost 3/4 full and it's a terabyte drive, this did take a little while. But it's one of those things you can approach with a sort of a Zen attitude, you know. You just set it going, leave it to do its thing, and don't worry about it. Go and do something else. I went and did something else a lot that week. When the Mac arrived, I went down a slightly different route. partly occasioned by the fact that this is a USB-A connector. It's a USB 3 USB-A connector, but it's a USB-A connector nonetheless. And the Mac did have two USB-A connectors, but at the time they were both in use, one for the mouse and one for the keyboard that I used to actually fire up the Mac and get it going. I'll return to that mouse and keyboard in my next video. However, what I had decided was that I was going to get a hub. I'd looked around and there were a number of external hubs available for the Mac Mini. Some of which, quite a few of which, had a home for a SATA SSD. However, most of them were of the old 2.5-inch style SSD, like this one in here. Well, that's actually a hard disk, but it's a 2.5-inch hard disk. What I wanted was to look at one of these new disk on a stick, M.2, I think they're called, drives. And I started to look around. The other problem with these hubs that were available, your Mac Mini sat on top of them. So it made it just a taller Mac Mini, a bit like a Mac Studio in appearance, but not quite as tall. There were quite a few reviews that said there were heat dissipation issues, which is something that you really need to be on top of if you're going to use an NVMe drive, because they do put out some heat. What I decided in the end, having looked at a lot of reviews, and there's been a lot of YouTube reviews watched in this process, trust me, was to go for a Mini Saporu Mac Mini housing. This doesn't have the Mac Mini sat down flat, it actually stands it up at 90 degrees vertically. And this is what it looks like. Now, the reason I went for that is that the one thing that all of these have in common is that they have an SD card reader. And as I'm talking to you on camera, this is a camera that runs off an SD card. I'm not recording it straight to disk. So I needed a way to get that video off the SD card and onto the Mac, because ultimately I will be doing my video editing on the Mac. The other advantage is, of course, because the Mac is stood up, heat dissipation isn't a problem. The entire underside of the Mac is exposed to the air and cooling won't be a problem. And it allowed me to put in an NVMe drive. Okay, just a minute. Forgot to do this bit when I was doing the main part of the video. When I came to buy the Mini Saporu hub, I looked on Amazon and they were over £100. I think today it's £115. When I looked on Mini Saporu's website, it was £57. Still is today. But you had to wait 10 days to get it shipped from China. I thought, I can wait. And I did. Save myself a bit of money. On with the show. So, all well and good. I'd transferred my stuff on and off the drives, which were now ExFAT, and I used that NVMe drive as a holding drive whilst I copied everything down off the disks again, reformatted them again, this time to APFS, and then copied it back up. Apparently, if you use ExFAT with a Mac, there are known cases of problems and data loss, and I wanted to avoid that. Before I could plug my drives into the Mac, I had to buy some cabling, because the hub that they were all plugged into, USB 3 hub, but again, USB-A cable. That's the one that came with the hub. So I had to buy a USB 3 to USB-C cable that would plug into the USB-C ports on the back of the Mac Mini. The USB-A ports on the back of the Mac Mini aren't USB 3, which is a bit of a surprise, but there you go. So I swapped the cable over, plugged the USB-C cable into the back of the Mac Mini, and lo and behold, the Mac recognised all of my disks. And here we are. This is a screenshot of my Mac desktop showing you all the disks down the right hand side. So what we've got is the NVMe drive in the Mini Sapporo hub, which is a 1 terabyte Samsung 970 Evo Plus. That's an old hard disk drive which just carries lots of miscellaneous bits and pieces. My orchestral drive, which is a Samsung T7. The projects drive, which is a Samsung 1 terabyte 870. A libraries drive, which is a Crucial 480 megabyte SSD, and the Contact, which is a Crucial 1 terabyte SSD. So there's a fair amount. They're all SSDs apart from that one there, the PCL, which is from an old 2010 laptop. So half a terabyte drive. It's all well and good. Everything's hunky-dory, everything's running. Then it came to the point where I wanted to do some speed tests. Now, before I had unplugged all of those from the laptop, but they were all formatted to ExFAT, I'd run some speed tests using the Blackmagic speed test, which you can download. And I'll put a link down below as to where you can get it for Windows. For Mac users, you download it from the Apple Store. With my drives, typically I was getting read speeds of over 400 megabits per second for the SSDs. The exception was the Samsung T7, which I bought for the orchestral drive. That had got rave reviews, but that was slower. It was 388 megabits per second, running through the hub over USB-A or USB 3 rather. The reason I bought that was that previously what is now my projects drive was my orchestral drive. But if you recall, my laptop's got twin SSDs and I wanted to move the projects folder onto its own drive. I didn't want to use the Mini Sapporo in the hub. I've got other plans for that, which I'll come to in a future video. So being well equipped for SSDs, I had bought the Samsung T7 as an orchestral drive because it was supposed to be so fast. And yet, through the hub, it was slower. It was the slowest of all of them. After I'd gone through the process of transferring them from ExFAT to APFS, and they were then plugged into the hub running through the Mac, to my surprise, they were all slower. By about 10%. The Contact library, which is a Crucial 1 terabyte, had dropped its read speed from 457 megabits per second on the laptop to 398 on the Mac. And I'd seen a corresponding drop for the others. For the Samsung, the T7, on the hub, it dropped to 325 megabits per second. Now, when I bought the T7, it came with two cables, a USB-A cable and a USB-C cable. When I plugged it into the Mac using one of the USB-C ports on the back of the Mac, using the USB-C cable it had come with, to my surprise, the speed rocketed to 781 megabits per second. Now, whether that means that the hub, which is a USB 3 hub, is throttling the through speed, or there's some compromise because it's having to deal with so many parallel data streams, I don't know. If anybody has any bright ideas, please put them below. It may simply be that the fact that the M2 SATA 2.5-inch discs have reached their maximum potential. On the other hand, the behaviour of the T7 Samsung leads me to think otherwise. And for anybody who's interested, the NVMe drive that sits in the Mini-Saporu hub has a read speed of 974 megabits per second, twice as fast as the SATAs. So a new hub, a Thunderbolt hub, may be on the cards. Let's see if that improves the read speed. But I'm not that worried, given the fact that the read speed's approximate to what I was getting before. There are some libraries which are slow to load, and they're going to end up on the Mini-Saporu. But as I say, I'll come back to that in a future video. But having gone through all that, I was ready now to download and install the software. And we'll pick up on that in the next video. Until then, you take care of yourselves.